The clock on the wall showed 6:30 p.m. and Rosa knew it was going to be another long night. She tied her black apron around her waist and checked her reflection in the small mirror by the kitchen door. 3 months ago, she never imagined she'd be working as a waitress, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. Romano's Italian restaurant was nothing like the small diners she was used to. The walls were covered with expensive artwork, crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, and soft classical music played in the background. The kind of place where a single bottle of wine cost more than most people made in a day. Rosa had learned quickly that the customers here expected perfection, and they weren't shy about letting you know when they didn't get it. She walked through the dining room, checking that each table was set perfectly. The white tablecloths had to be spotless, the silverware polished to a mirror shine, and the wine glasses positioned just so. Mr. Romano was very particular about these things, and Rosa couldn't afford to make mistakes. Not when she needed this job so badly. The first customers began arriving around 7. Rosa watched them from behind the hostess stand as they handed their expensive coats to the coat check girl and were seated at the best tables. The women wore jewelry that probably cost more than Rosa's entire year's rent, and the men had that confident way of walking that comes with never having to worry about money. "Table 7 is yours tonight," said Jenny, the other waitress working the evening shift. She gave Rosa a sympathetic look. "Good luck with that one." Rosa looked over at table 7 and saw a man in his 50s settling into his chair. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost thousands of dollars, and his silver hair was styled in that way that screamed expensive barbershop. Even from across the room, she could see the gold watch on his wrist catching the light from the chandelier above. As she approached the table, she could hear him talking loudly to the 3 other men seated with him. His voice carried that tone of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. "The property market is absolutely booming right now," he was saying, cutting into his appetizer with theatrical precision. "I just closed a deal on a downtown building that's going to make me another $2 million this year alone." Rosa waited politely for a pause in the conversation before stepping forward. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I get you anything to drink to start?" The man at the head of the table barely looked up at her. "We'll have a bottle of your most expensive red wine, and make sure it's properly decanted. I can't stand it when restaurants don't know how to serve wine properly." "Of course, sir, I'll have that right out for you." As Rosa walked away, she could hear him continuing his conversation about his latest business deals. She had served plenty of wealthy customers over the past 3 months, but something about this man rubbed her the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he talked about money like it was a game, or how he seemed to look right through her like she wasn't even there. The wine service went smoothly, and Rosa took their dinner orders without any problems. But as the evening went on, she noticed the man becoming louder and more boastful. His dinner companions seemed to hang on his every word, laughing at his jokes and nodding along with his stories about buying and selling properties like they were trading cards. During a brief lull in their conversation, Rosa was clearing their salad plates when something caught her eye. In the corner of the restaurant sat a beautiful grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the soft lighting. It was a Steinway, she could tell from the elegant curve of its body, and the way the light reflected off its polished finish. She couldn't help but stare at it for a moment. The piano had been sitting there unused for as long as she'd been working at Romano's. Mr. Romano had told her it belonged to his late wife, who used to play for the guests on special occasions. Now it served more as decoration than anything else, but Rosa found herself drawn to it every night. "Excuse me, miss," came a sharp voice from behind her. Rosa turned to see the man from table 7 looking at her with an amused expression. "Are you going to clear these plates, or are you planning to stare at that piano all night?" Heat rose to Rosa's cheeks. "I'm sorry, sir, I was just..." She quickly gathered the remaining plates, trying to ignore the snickers from his dinner companions. But the man wasn't done with her yet. "You seem awfully interested in that piano. Don't tell me you actually think you know how to play it." Rosa felt the attention of nearby tables turning toward them. The restaurant was busy, but conversations were beginning to quiet as people sensed drama unfolding. "I was just admiring it, sir. It's a beautiful instrument." The man leaned back in his chair with a smug smile. Beautiful, yes, but completely wasted in a place like this. That's a $200,000 piano sitting there collecting dust because nobody here has the class or education to appreciate it properly. Rosa bit her tongue and continued clearing the table. She had learned over the past 3 months that arguing with customers, especially wealthy ones, was a sure way to lose her job. And she couldn't afford to lose this job, not with everything depending on it. You know what I find funny about people like you? The man continued, his voice getting louder. You look at something beautiful and expensive and you think you understand it. But there's a difference between looking at art and actually being able to create it. One of his dinner companions chuckled. Come on, Richard. Leave the poor girl alone. But Richard was just getting started. No, this is actually quite interesting. I bet if I asked our waitress here to play us a song on that piano, she'd probably think she could do it. Isn't that right, sweetheart? The entire section of the restaurant had gone quiet now. Rosa could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see what would happen next. Her hands trembled slightly as she finished stacking the plates. I need to get these to the kitchen, she said quietly, hoping to escape the situation. Oh, don't be shy now, Richard said, his voice dripping with false encouragement. I'm genuinely curious. Have you ever played piano before? Rosa paused, the weight of the plates in her hands suddenly feeling much heavier. She thought about her brother lying in his hospital bed 3 blocks away, about the medical bills that kept piling up, about the dreams she'd had to put aside to take care of him. A little, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's eyes lit up with delight. A little. Did you hear that, gentlemen? She plays a little piano. He turned back to Rosa with a predatory smile. Well then, this evening just got much more interesting. Rosa knew she should walk away. She should take the plates to the kitchen, bring them their dessert menus, and finish out her shift like any other night. But something in Richard's tone, something in the way he was looking at her like she was entertainment for his amusement, made her stay. What exactly are you suggesting, sir? She asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick leather wallet. I'm suggesting we make this evening a little more fun. I'll bet you $500 that you can't play a single song on that piano well enough to impress me. The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had noticed something was happening, and Rosa could see them peeking through the service window. And if I can? Rosa asked. Richard's smile widened. Then I'll double it. $1,000 cash, right here and now. He pulled out a stack of bills and placed them on the table. But when you embarrass yourself up there, you'll admit in front of everyone here that you were just pretending to be something you're not. Rosa looked at the money on the table, then at the piano in the corner, then back at Richard's smug face. She thought about her brother, about the conversation she'd had with his doctor just yesterday about the next round of treatments they couldn't afford. You're serious about this? She asked. Dead serious, sweetheart. What do you say? Ready to show us what a little piano playing looks like? Rosa stared at the stack of money on the table, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. $1,000. That was enough to cover her brother's medication for the next 2 months. Maybe even pay for some of the specialist appointments the insurance company kept denying. Well? Richard leaned forward, enjoying every second of her hesitation. Cat got your tongue, sweetheart? Or are you finally realizing you bit off more than you can chew? The other diners were watching now, some trying to be subtle about it, others openly staring. Rosa could see a couple at the table near the window whispering to each other, and an elderly woman shaking her head disapprovingly at Richard's behavior. But nobody was speaking up to stop this humiliation. I don't know, Rosa said quietly, still looking at the money. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. Richard's laugh was harsh and loud. Of course it's not a good idea. That's what I've been trying to tell you. You're a waitress, not a musician. There's nothing wrong with that, but let's not pretend you're something you're not. One of his dinner companions, a younger man with nervous eyes, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Richard, maybe we should just let her get back to work. The poor girl looks terrified. Terrified? Richard's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. She's the one who said she could play piano. I'm just giving her the chance to prove it. He turned back to Rosa with that same cruel smile. Unless, of course, you were lying about that too. Rosa felt something hot and angry flare up in her chest. She'd been dealing with people like Richard her whole life. People who looked at her uniform or her accent or the tired look in her eyes and decided they knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. I wasn't lying, she said, her voice stronger now. Then prove it. Richard gestured toward the piano with a flourish. Go ahead, play us a song, something impressive. After all, you wouldn't want to disappoint all these nice people who are watching. Rosa looked around the restaurant again. The kitchen staff had completely stopped what they were doing and were lined up at the service window watching the drama unfold. Mr. Romano had emerged from his office and was standing near the bar, his arms crossed and his face concerned. He caught Rosa's eye and gave her a small nod as if to say it was okay whatever she decided to do. What kind of song? Rosa asked. Richard shrugged. Dealer's choice. But it better be good. None of that chopsticks nonsense or Mary Had a Little Lamb. If you're going to take my money, you better earn it. Rosa took a deep breath and set the stack of dirty plates down on a nearby empty table. She could feel her hands shaking slightly, but whether it was from nerves or anger, she wasn't sure. Before I do this, she said, I want to make sure I understand the rules. If I play a song and you think it's good enough to be impressive, I get the $1,000. If you don't think it's good enough, I have to admit in front of everyone that I was pretending to be something I'm not. That's right, Richard said, leaning back in his chair like he was settling in for a show. And just so we're clear, I have very high standards. I've been to the opera in Milan, the symphony in Vienna. I know what real music sounds like. And you'll be fair about judging it? Richard laughed again. Sweetheart, I'll be more than fair. I'll be generous. All you have to do is play something that doesn't sound like a child banging on the keys, and I'll consider it impressive for someone in your situation. The condescension in his voice made Rosa's jaw clench. She looked at the piano again, sitting there in its corner like a sleeping giant. She hadn't played in front of people in almost 2 years, not since before her parents died and her whole world turned upside down. Okay, she said finally. I'll do it. A ripple of excitement went through the restaurant. Rosa could hear chairs scraping as people turned to get a better view, and someone at the bar actually stood up to see over the crowd. Excellent. Richard clapped his hands together. This should be entertaining, gentlemen. We're about to witness either a miracle or a complete disaster. Rosa untied her apron and folded it carefully, setting it on Richard's table. The simple act felt strangely significant, like she was taking off a costume and revealing something underneath. Just remember our deal, Richard called after her as she walked toward the piano. When this doesn't go well, you owe me an honest admission about who you really are. Rosa stopped walking and turned back to face him. And when it does go well, you owe me an apology. Richard's smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. Deal. But I wouldn't start spending that money yet if I were you. The walk to the piano felt like it took forever. Every step echoed in the suddenly quiet restaurant, and Rosa could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following her movement. When she reached the bench, she stood there for a moment, just looking at the instrument. It really was beautiful. The black lacquer finish was perfect. Not a scratch or fingerprint visible. Someone had been taking very good care of it, even if nobody had been playing it. Rosa ran her fingers along the edge of the keyboard cover, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingertips. Any day now, Richard called from his table. We don't have all night. Rosa lifted the keyboard cover and set it carefully to the side. The keys were pristine, ivory white and ebony black in perfect alternating patterns. She pressed middle C gently, and the note rang out clear and true. The piano was perfectly in tune. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it to the right height. The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the ambient music from the sound system seemed to have stopped. Rosa could hear her own breathing, could feel her heart beating against her ribs. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes for just a moment. In her mind, she was back in her old apartment, practicing on the small upright piano her parents had saved up to buy her for her 16th birthday. She could almost hear her mother's voice encouraging her from the kitchen, telling her to play with feeling, not just technique. "This is taking an awfully long time," Richard said, his voice cutting through her memories. Having second thoughts, Rosa opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "Just deciding what to play. I want to make sure it's something appropriate for the audience." She turned back to the piano and let her fingers find their position. She had decided on the piece the moment she sat down, something that would either vindicate her completely or destroy her utterly. There was no middle ground with what she was about to attempt. "Here we go," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. And then she began to play. The first notes that came from the piano weren't what anyone expected. Instead of some simple tune or nursery rhyme, Rosa began playing something complex and hauntingly beautiful. The melody started soft and gentle, like a whisper, but there was something underneath it that made everyone in the restaurant lean forward in their seats. Richard's smug expression began to change. The confident smile that had been plastered on his face for the past 10 minutes started to fade as he realized that the sounds coming from the piano were not those of an amateur. His dinner companions had stopped their conversation entirely, their forks suspended halfway to their mouths. But what Richard and everyone else in that restaurant didn't know was the story behind the woman sitting at that piano. They saw a tired waitress in a wrinkled uniform, someone who served their food and cleaned their tables. They had no idea that just 3 years ago, Rosa had been considered one of the most promising young pianists on the East Coast. As a child, Rosa had been what people called a prodigy. While other kids were playing video games or watching cartoons, she was spending 4 hours a day at the piano, her small fingers dancing across the keys with a precision that amazed her teachers. By the time she was 12, she was winning competitions against teenagers twice her age. Her parents had sacrificed everything for her music. Her father worked double shifts at the factory, and her mother cleaned offices at night, all so they could afford Rosa's lessons with the best teachers in the state. They had a dream that their daughter would one day play in the great concert halls of the world, and Rosa had believed in that dream too. The music flowing from the piano now was Chopin's Ballade No. 1, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Rosa had first learned it when she was 17, preparing for her audition at the prestigious Berklee College of Music. She had practiced it until her fingers bled, until she could play it in her sleep. The scholarship to Berklee had been everything her family had worked for. Rosa remembered the day the acceptance letter came, how her parents had cried with joy, how they had called all their relatives to share the news. Their little girl was going to be a professional musician. College had been like a dream come true. Rosa threw herself into her studies, spending countless hours in practice rooms, learning from professors who had played with world-renowned orchestras. She made friends with other serious musicians, people who understood the dedication and sacrifice required to excel at such a demanding art form. During her junior year, she had even won a small competition that allowed her to perform as a soloist with the college orchestra. Standing on that stage, feeling the music flow through her and out into the audience, Rosa had never felt more alive or more certain of her purpose in life. But then everything changed. The phone call came on a Tuesday night in March. Rosa was in the practice room, working on a particularly difficult passage in a Rachmaninoff concerto, when her roommate burst through the door with tears in her eyes. There had been an accident. A drunk driver had hit her parents' car on their way home from her father's second job. Rosa dropped out of school immediately to care for her younger brother Luis, who was only 15 and had nowhere else to go. The insurance money helped for a while, but medical bills from the accident ate through their savings faster than she could have imagined. Then, 6 months after the funeral, Luis was diagnosed with leukemia. The doctor said his chances were good if he could get the right treatment. But good treatment costs money. Lots of money. The kind of money that a college dropout with no work experience couldn't easily come by. So Rosa did what she had to do. She sold her piano, the beautiful baby grand her parents had saved for 2 years to buy her for her 18th birthday. She took whatever job she could find, working in retail, cleaning houses, and eventually landing the waitressing job at Romano's. Every night she came home exhausted, her feet aching, and her hands smelling like dish soap instead of feeling the smooth ivory of piano keys. But she kept going because Luis needed her, because giving up wasn't an option. She hadn't played piano in almost 2 years, not since she sold hers and moved into the tiny apartment near the hospital where Luis received his treatments. There was no room for a piano there, no money for one, and honestly, no time to play even if she had one. But muscle memory is a powerful thing. As Rosa's fingers moved across the keys at Romano's, years of training came flooding back. The complicated passages that had once required intense concentration now flowed naturally. Her hands remembered exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly how to shape each phrase to bring out the emotion in the music. The ballade was building now, moving from the gentle opening theme into the more dramatic middle section. Rosa could feel the power of the music filling the restaurant, could sense the complete silence of the audience behind her. But she was lost in the piece, lost in memories of who she used to be. She thought about her parents, about how proud they would have been to see her playing again. She thought about Luis, fighting his battle in the hospital 3 blocks away, and how he always asked her to hum to him when he couldn't sleep after his chemotherapy sessions. The music became her way of talking to them, of saying all the things she couldn't put into words. The frustration of dreams deferred, the exhaustion of working multiple jobs, the fear that she might lose her brother too, the guilt of sometimes wondering what her life might have been like if she hadn't had to choose between her music and her family. Richard sat at his table, his mouth slightly open, all traces of his earlier smugness completely gone. He had been to operas and symphonies around the world, had heard some of the finest musicians of his generation perform. He knew enough about music to recognize that what he was witnessing was not just good, it was extraordinary. The other diners in the restaurant were equally transfixed. An elderly couple near the window had tears in their eyes. A businessman who had been loudly talking on his phone when Rosa started playing had hung up and was listening with complete attention. Even the kitchen staff had abandoned their posts. Cooks and dishwashers stood in the doorway, their work forgotten, drawn by the incredible sounds coming from the corner of the dining room. Mr. Romano stood behind the bar, his own eyes wet with unshed tears. The piano had been his wife's, and she had been an accomplished pianist herself before her illness. Hearing those keys sing again after 2 years of silence brought back memories of evenings when she would play for their guests, filling the restaurant with music and joy. Rosa was approaching the climax of the piece now, the part where Chopin's genius truly shone through. Her fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision, each note crystal clear despite the complexity of the passages. This was music that demanded not just technical skill, but deep emotional understanding, and Rosa had both in abundance. As she played, Rosa made a decision. Whatever happened after tonight, whatever Richard said or did, she wasn't going to hide anymore. She was tired of pretending to be less than she was, tired of letting circumstances define her entire identity. The music soared toward its dramatic conclusion, and Rosa felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, the pure joy of making music. The final notes of Chopin's ballad rang through Romano's restaurant like thunder, each chord crashing over the stunned audience with the force of a tidal wave. Rosa's hands moved with lightning speed across the keys, her fingers dancing through passages that most professional pianists would struggle with. But she wasn't struggling. She was flying. As the last chord faded into silence, the restaurant remained frozen for what felt like an eternity. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant rumble of traffic from the street outside. Then slowly one person began to clap. It was the elderly woman near the window, the one who had been shaking her head at Richard's behavior earlier. Her applause was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure if breaking the spell was appropriate. But then others joined, and the businessman who had been ignoring everything around him suddenly stood up, his hands coming together in thunderous applause. The young couple at the corner table followed suit, their faces bright with amazement. Within seconds, the entire restaurant had erupted in the kind of applause usually reserved for concert halls and opera houses. People weren't just clapping. They were standing, some wiping tears from their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The kitchen staff rushed out from behind their stations, their chef's hats askew, applauding wildly. Even the bartender, who had seen everything in his 20 years in the business, was clapping so hard his hands hurt. Rosa sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, breathing heavily. She felt like she had just run a marathon, her heart pounding from the adrenaline of the performance. For a moment she had forgotten where she was, forgotten about the bet, forgotten about Richard's cruel words. She had been transported back to who she used to be, to the person she had been before life forced her to become someone else. The applause seemed to go on forever, but eventually it began to fade. Rosa stood up from the piano bench, her legs shaky, and turned to face the audience. The faces looking back at her were filled with wonder, respect, and something she hadn't seen directed at her in a long time. Admiration. But it was Richard's face that held her attention. The man who had been so confident, so smugly certain of his superiority just minutes before, now looked like he had seen a ghost. His mouth was hanging open, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. The stack of money still sat on his table, but he seemed to have forgotten all about it. "How?" he whispered, his voice so quiet that Rosa almost couldn't hear him over the lingering applause. How did I what?" Rosa asked, walking slowly back toward his table. Her voice was calm, but there was something different about her now. The timid, apologetic waitress from earlier was gone, replaced by someone who had just remembered her own worth. Richard struggled to find words. That was professional level. That was conservatory training. He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. "That was what I tried to tell you," Rosa said simply. "I can play piano, not a little. I can really play." One of Richard's dinner companions, the nervous young man who had tried to stop the bet earlier, was staring at Rosa with newfound respect. "Where did you learn to play like that? That was incredible." "Berklee College of Music," Rosa said. "I was a piano major there for 3 years." "Berklee?" The man's eyebrows shot up. "That's one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. What happened? Why am I working as a waitress?" Rosa finished his question. "Because sometimes life doesn't go according to plan. Sometimes you have to choose between your dreams and your family. And sometimes taking care of the people you love is more important than taking care of yourself." Richard was still staring at her like he couldn't quite believe what he had witnessed. "But you're a waitress," he said weakly, as if saying it would somehow make the performance he had just heard disappear. "I'm a lot of things," Rosa replied. "I'm a waitress, yes. I'm also a sister, a daughter, a musician, and a person who works hard to take care of the people I love. Just because you can only see one part of who I am doesn't mean that's all I am." The restaurant was still buzzing with conversation about the performance. Rosa could hear fragments of conversations from different tables. "Did you see her technique? I've never heard anyone play like that in person. She should be performing at Carnegie Hall." Mr. Romano appeared at Rosa's side, his eyes still wet with tears. "Rosa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea. My wife would have loved to hear you play. She would have said you have the gift." "Thank you, Mr. Romano," Rosa said softly. "That means a lot to me." Richard finally seemed to find his voice again. I don't understand. If you can play like that, why are you here? Why aren't you performing professionally?" Rosa looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because my 15-year-old brother has leukemia, and someone needs to work to pay for his medical treatments. Because my parents died in a car accident 2 years ago, and I'm all the family he has left. Because sometimes being a good person means making sacrifices that people like you wouldn't understand." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He, looked down at the money on his table, then back up at Rosa. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't know," Rosa agreed. "But you didn't bother to find out either. You looked at me and decided you knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. You made assumptions based on my uniform and my job, and you thought that gave you the right to humiliate me in front of all these people." Richard reached for the stack of money with trembling hands. "The bet," he said. "You won. This is yours." Rosa looked at the money for a moment, then back at Richard. "Keep it," she said. "What?" Richard looked shocked. "But we had a deal. You played beautifully. You more than earned this." "I don't want your money," Rosa said firmly. "I don't want anything from you. What I want is for you to remember this moment the next time you think about judging someone based on their appearance or their job. What I want is for you to remember that every person you meet has a story, has dreams, has talents that you might never see if you don't take the time to look." Richard stared at her, his face a mixture of shame and amazement. "But the money could help with your brother's medical bills. You said." "I'll find another way," Rosa said. "I always do. But I won't take money from someone who thought so little of me that he was willing to bet on my failure for his own entertainment." The restaurant had grown quiet again, everyone listening to the conversation between Rosa and Richard. There was something powerful happening here, something that went beyond just a musical performance or a one-bet. Rosa picked up her apron from Richard's table and tied it around her waist once more. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other tables to serve, and you have a dessert menu to look at." As she walked away, the entire restaurant burst into applause again, but this time it wasn't just for her musical talent. It was for her dignity, her strength, and her refusal to let someone else's cruelty define her worth. Richard sat in stunned silence, the money still in his hands, watching Rosa return to her work as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But everything had changed, and he knew it. The question was, what was he going to do about it? 3 weeks had passed since that unforgettable night at Romano's, but Rosa still felt different every time she walked into the restaurant for her shift. Something had changed in her that evening, something that went deeper than just playing piano again. She had found a piece of herself that she thought was lost forever. The other staff members treated her differently now, too. Jenny, her fellow waitress, would sometimes catch Rosa humming while she worked and smile knowingly. The kitchen staff, who used to barely acknowledge her existence, now greeted her warmly and seemed genuinely interested in how her day was going. But the biggest change was in Mr. Romano himself. The day after her performance, he had pulled her aside during her break and made an offer that still made her heart race when she thought about it. "Rosa," he had said, his eyes serious but kind. "I've been thinking about what happened last night. That piano has been silent for 2 years, ever since my wife passed away. But hearing you play, it brought life back into this place. It brought her memory back in the most beautiful way." Rosa had listened quietly, not sure where the conversation was heading. "I want to offer you something," Mr. Romano continued. "What would you say to playing here on weekend evenings? Nothing fancy, just background music while people dine. I could pay you extra for it, on top of your regular wages." The offer had stunned Rosa. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a way to have music in her life again without giving up the steady income she needed for Luis's medical bills. She had started the following Friday night, playing soft classical pieces and jazz standards while the dinner crowd enjoyed their meals. The response had been overwhelming. Customers lingered longer over their wine, the atmosphere became more elegant and relaxed, and Mr. Romano was getting calls from people asking specifically about the pianist at Romano's. Tonight was Rosa's third weekend performance, and she was setting up at the piano when she noticed a familiar figure being seated at table 7. Her heart sank as she recognized Richard, the man who had tried to humiliate her just 3 weeks earlier. He was alone this time, no business associates or friends to impress. He looked different somehow, less polished than before. His expensive suit was still perfectly tailored, but there was something in his posture, something in the way he carried himself that seemed changed. Rosa finished adjusting the piano bench and began her first set with a gentle Debussy piece. She tried to focus on the music, to lose herself in the flowing melodies the way she had been doing for the past 2 weeks, but she kept finding her eyes drifting toward table 7. Richard sat quietly through her entire first set, nursing a single glass of wine and barely touching his appetizer. When she took her break, Rosa was surprised to see him stand up and walk toward the piano. "Rosa," he said quietly when he reached her. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Rosa looked around the restaurant nervously. "I'm not sure that's a good idea. I'm working, and after what happened last time." "Please," Richard said, and there was something in his voice that Rosa had never heard before. It was humility. "I know I don't deserve it, but I really need to talk to you." Against her better judgment, Rosa nodded. "Okay, but just for a minute." Richard gestured toward an empty table near the piano. They sat down across from each other, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I've been coming here every night for the past 3 weeks, Richard finally said. "Not to eat, really. Just to think about what happened, about what I did." Rosa waited for him to continue. "I can't stop thinking about your performance that night," he went on. "Not just because it was beautiful, which it was, but because of what it made me realize about myself, about the kind of person I've become." He looked down at his hands, which were folded on the table in front of him. "I built my entire identity around having money, around being successful, around being better than other people. And somewhere along the way, I started believing that my bank account determined my worth as a human being. Worse than that, I started believing it determined everyone else's worth too." Rosa listened in silence, not sure what to say. "That night when you played," Richard continued, "I realized that I had never asked myself what I was actually contributing to the world. I'd never wondered if the people serving my food or cleaning my office or parking my car might have talents and dreams and stories that were just as valuable as mine." He looked up at Rosa then, and she could see genuine pain in his eyes. "I went home that night and couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what you said about your brother, about having to choose between your dreams and your family, and I realized that I've never had to choose anything difficult in my entire life. I've never had to sacrifice for anyone else. I've never even really thought about anyone else." Rosa felt a strange mix of emotions listening to him. Part of her was still angry about the way he had treated her, but another part recognized the sincerity in his voice. "The next day," Richard continued, "I started making some changes. I contacted the children's hospital where your brother is being treated. I made a donation to their music therapy program. I figured if music could bring healing to one family, maybe it could help others too." Rosa's eyes widened in surprise. "You donated to the hospital?" "It was the least I could do," Richard said, "but that was just the beginning. I've been thinking a lot about the people who work in my buildings, the staff in my office, all the people I've interacted with over the years without really seeing them as people." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "I know you wouldn't take the money from the bet, and I understand why, but I was hoping you might consider this." Rosa unfolded the paper and gasped. It was a check made out to her, but not for the $1,000 from their original bet. This check was for $50,000. "Richard, I can't accept this," she said immediately, trying to hand the check back to him. "It's not charity," he said quickly, "and it's not guilt money. It's an investment." "An investment in what?" "In you, in your music, in giving you the chance to finish what you started." Richard leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I did some research after that night. I found out about Berkeley, about how prestigious it is, about how rare it is for someone to get the kind of scholarship you had. I also found out that they have a program for students who had to leave for family emergencies. You could go back. Rosa, you could finish your degree." Rosa stared at the check, her hands trembling. "But Luis, his treatments." "The check covers that too," Richard said. "I calculated the average cost of leukemia treatment for someone his age. There's enough there to pay for his care and for you to return to school." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. Why are you doing this? Because 3 weeks ago you taught me something about dignity and strength that I never learned in any of my business dealings. You showed me what it looks like to have principles, to choose self-respect over money, to put family before personal ambition. Richard's voice grew softer. You made me want to be a better person. This is me trying to become that person. Rosa looked at the check again, then back at Richard. If I take this, what do you want in return? Nothing, Richard said firmly. Well, actually that's not true. I want you to promise me that you'll use your gift. I want you to finish school and become the musician you were meant to be. I want you to play in those concert halls you dreamed about. And someday, when you're performing at Carnegie Hall or the Kennedy Center, I want to be able to sit in the audience and remember the night you taught me that real worth isn't measured in dollars. Rosa wiped the tears from her eyes and looked around the restaurant. Other diners were starting to look in their direction, probably wondering when the piano music would resume. I need to think about this, she said finally. Of course, Richard said, standing up. Take all the time you need. But Rosa, don't let pride keep you from accepting help when it's offered with a sincere heart. You taught me that everyone has value regardless of their circumstances. Let me prove I learned that lesson by helping you rediscover yours. As Richard walked back to his table, Rosa sat holding the check, her mind racing. She thought about Luis, about the possibility of not having to worry about his medical bills anymore. She thought about returning to Berkeley, about practicing piano for hours instead of serving tables. But mostly, she thought about the power of music to change people's hearts, and how sometimes the most unexpected encounters can transform both the teacher and the student in ways neither of them could have imagined. The answer, she realized, was already clear in her heart. She just needed the courage to accept it.